Hi, this is Pastor Andrew with East Marion Baptist Church, and we are continuing with our sermon series in 1 Corinthians Chapter 10. And last week as I preached, I sensed the need that we needed to slow down and pay attention to one verse and one subject only, and that is verse 13 of chapter 10. We talked about it last week, but I want to pay special attention to it today. And that verse reads, "No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it." The subject that I want to talk to you about today is the truth, that God will never leave you stranded in your temptation. He makes promises that he will not. This passage says that he is faithful and that he will provide the way of escape. God will not leave you stranded in your temptation. We face various kinds of temptations, and all of us do, and so it becomes rather important for us to learn how we respond to these things and how God empowers us to respond to these things. But it's not just the types of temptations that we often consider when we think of the word temptation. It's not just being attracted to things that we ought not be attracted to, or to do the things we ought not do, or say the things we ought not say. This word temptation in this passage is a bigger word than our English word temptation has the ability to handle. It includes the idea of trials and temptations. Now, the reason that our Bible translators have chosen the word temptation is because that word better encapsulates the goal of Satan in either a trial or a temptation, and that is to get us to sin. That is his motivation in everything in your life as a Christian. And why does he want us to sin? Because it is sin that enables him to ruin or destroy the life that God wishes for us to have. Jesus said plainly about Satan that the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. That is his central motivation in everything going on in your life. And so if you desire sin of some kind, you are experiencing some temptation or going through some trial, his motivation in that is that if he can get you to sin and introduce some death, some destruction, or steal some of your joy, some of your vitality, that is what he is seeking to do. And yet God tells us that he is faithful to make sure that we have a way out of such situations. Satan has done this for millennia. He has done it all of your life. He is a master at understanding what it is that causes us to sin. What will tempt us? When I was a kid, I used to go fishing with my dad at the beach quite a lot. One summer, we went fishing and did not know that we had gotten to the beach around the time that the Spanish mackerel were running. We went out to the pier where we always fished, and my dad began talking to the locals there, as he always did, and finding out what was running and how to fish them. And they talked to us about the Spanish mackerel. And they said that when you go fishing for Spanish mackerel, that you fish for them in a rather peculiar way. They explained to us that what we needed to do is to just get a sinker and put it at the end of a line, and then attach gold hooks a foot apart, about 3 gold hooks up the line. Don't put any bait on it at all, and simply drop it in the water off the edge of the pier and bob it up and down. Well, we didn't know what to expect out of this. It seemed really too good to be true, but we tried it. We tossed our line in, began bobbing it up and down, and within seconds, we had 3 Spanish mackerel hit all 3 hooks, pull them in, keep them, throw them back, whatever we needed to do, toss it back in, seconds, minutes, catching more. It was unreal, the amount of Spanish mackerel we caught. It was the best day of fishing I've ever had in my life. I can't understand how some people can just sit with a rod in the water and catch nothing and consider that a good day. That's a boring day as far as I'm concerned. But this was a fun day of catching fish. This is how Satan operates. Satan knows what it takes to catch you. He has been a student of you your entire life. He's been a student of human beings his entire life. And so by the time, say, maybe you were 3 years old or 4 years old, he'd already pretty well figured out what it would take to catch you, to tempt you, to get you to sin, and he is rather effective at it. He doesn't need to change his strategy too awful much because he knows what you will bite at. And so it becomes important to understand yourself. What is it that Satan is most apt to use when fishing for me? What are my triggers? What is it that makes me more susceptible to this temptation than at other times? It is our willful blindness towards this that often makes us more susceptible to sin and temptation. But when we begin to understand where it is that we're vulnerable, it is then that we begin to understand how God can create the way of escape. Because God's made promises. He will never leave you stranded. The old joke is told of a preacher who was at his church when an enormous storm came and began sweeping through the town where he lived. The waters began to rise on the streets, and he went out to the front porch to discover, to his astonishment, that the road had been basically washed away by a river, and there's no way for him to leave. About that time, a man rode up on a canoe, and he yelled to the preacher, "Preacher, jump in the canoe. I'll get you out of here. The waters are rising." And the preacher said, "No, sir. My God will protect me." And then that man goes on, and then another man comes, in a motorboat this time, pulls up near the preacher, yells to him. He says, "Get in the boat. The water's rising. The levees are going to break. You're going to get it washed away if you don't get in the boat." And the preacher says, No. God's going to provide for me." And then the preacher begins to notice that the waters are rising too high for him to be out on the front porch. So he actually ends up having to climb up into the attic of the church and then eventually onto the roof of the church. And then he's clinging to the steeple of the church as the waters are so high, the entire church is almost underwater. And then a state trooper comes in on a helicopter and yells down to the preacher, drops a rope ladder to him and says, "Climb up." He says, "You're going to die. The water's going to wash you away if you don't get to safety." The preacher then again says, "God's going to take care of me. God's going to provide for me." And then the man ends up leaving. The helicopter ends up leaving. And sure enough, the preacher ends up getting washed away and he dies. And then he ends up in heaven and he's standing there before God one day. And he's just puzzled and he says, "God, why didn't you protect me? Why didn't you provide a way out for me?" And God responds. He says, "I provided you 2 boats and a helicopter. What else were you looking for?" See, that is exactly the attitude that we have towards temptation. God provides obvious ways of escape for us. We're simply not willing to take them. So the task for us today is to recognize where God does this. To take advantage of the fact that God makes a promise that He will never leave you stranded in your temptation, and to, in fact, take it. There are 4 specific ways I want you to consider how God does this. How God provides ways of escapes for you. 4 things are, and I could add 20 more to this, but these 4 for our purposes today. Number 1, He blocks our paths. Number 2, He makes the tempter flee. Number 3, He surrounds us. And number 4, He joins us. Number 1, thinking about how God blocks our paths, my mind goes to a passage in Hosea chapter 2, verses 5b through 7. In the book of Hosea, the people of Israel, God's people, are pictured as an adulterous wife. They are cheating on their husband, and their husband is God. They are choosing, rather than God, they are choosing false gods and idols, and they are worshiping them through all sorts of illicit sexual encounters and sinful encounters and such as this. And God looks at them, His heart breaks over them as a husband whose wife has left him, and God is pursuing them in their adultery. And in this passage in Hosea chapter 2, we're given a picture of this. We read that God speaking here, describing His people Israel, He says, "For she said, I will go after my lovers, who give me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my drink. Therefore I will hedge up her way with thorns, and I will build a wall against her, so that she cannot find her paths. She shall pursue her lovers, but not overtake them. And she shall seek them, but shall not find them. Then she shall say, I will go and return to my husband, for it was better for me then than now." Do you see what's being said here? If it's unclear to you, the idea is this, that while His people, while you are in the act of rebellion, that God at times looks at that and says, I'm not going to let that take place. I'm not going to let you continue in your rebellion. And so He blocks your way. He does something that stops you from being able to go after what it is that you're wanting to go after. Because He knows that that thing is destructive for you. It's deadly for you. So He chooses instead to stop you so that as you are bloodying yourself up against this hedge of thorns that He's made, that finally you'll go, goodness, it was easier for me. It was better for me when I was with my husband, when I was with my God. And so you will, in fact, at that point, finally turn away from sin and towards Him, not because you wanted to, but because God is faithful. Because He provides a way of escape, because He will never leave you stranded in your temptation. He'll even take over at times so as not to leave you to your own destructive devices. When I was in college, I had an experience that was something like this. I was in a Bible college, and in this Bible college, there was this really kind of, I think, cruel way of giving grades to students. So we're all Christians, and we all run, as these professors thought, on the honor system. And so, they would literally give us assignments to read a certain amount of text, and you would come in, and on your honor before the Lord, you read X amount. And what these professors would do, this was the cruel part, is they would make it so that if you read 100%, you got 100. If you read 99% or less, you got a 0. Well, in this theology class, this was the end of the semester, and we had to read an enormous amount of theology articles and come in to that last day of class and specify what percentage we read. It got around to me, the paper went around the class, and I had read about 97% of all the articles, which was a significant amount. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to finish these articles before the day's done, and so I'll just go ahead and jot down 100%, and I'll finish it, I'll make it right. And so that's what I did. In essence, I lied. I had not done that amount of work yet, and I justified it and so on. And turned it in, walked away feeling good about myself. And the next day, I went to work. Now, I worked for Mackerel nurseries, and I took care of these nurseries in various Home Depots around the Raleigh area. And I was in one of my Home Depots, and I was watering a row of arborvitaes, these big, tall plants, about 6 foot tall. And I was just not thinking about really much of anything when my mind went to this passage in Hosea. I had been studying the book of Hosea, and suddenly I thought about this hedged path as I was staring at this wall of arborvitaes right in front of me and watering them. And I thought to myself in that moment, I thought I would rather have this hedge, these actual arborvitaes right in front of me, than I would have something worse in the future. Conviction gripped my heart in that moment, and I literally, God did a hedge in my heart where I was like, I can't do this. I have to be honest. It was like God worked something out in me that made me desire honesty more than I desired the good grade. It wasn't something I conjured myself. He just simply did it. So I determined in that moment, okay, next Monday when class starts, I'll go into my professor's office, get there before anybody else does. I'll confess what I did. And I did that. Now, he was gracious to me, and he let me get the grade. But I didn't know that beforehand. I was simply putting myself in God's hand and trusting that obedience was more important than a good grade. God had hedged my paths. Why? Because God will not leave you stranded in your temptation. He will do something to bring you to himself. But God will also make the tempter flee at times. Sometimes, like before, God will stop you dead in your tracks. At other times, God will allow the temptation to come. He'll allow you to experience it. He'll allow you to desire it. And he will wait to see what you will do, waiting for that moment where the tempter will ultimately flee from you. This idea comes from James chapter 4, verse 7, where we are told, submit yourselves to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Now, why does he flee from you? Does he flee from you because he is intimidated by you? No, absolutely not. He is not afraid of you in the least, but he is afraid of the God who is with you. He is afraid of the God who stands behind you. The story is told of a tribesman in Africa who went to the river to go fetch water. And as he was at this river scooping water into a pail, he could hear a soft growl upstream from him. He looked up, and to his horror, he saw a panther prowling, coming right after him, stalking him. So the man leaves his pail, stands up, freezes in place. And he has one thought. There's only one thing I can do. I can try to intimidate the panther. So he screams with all of his might at the panther. Ah! Screams at the panther, and the panther stops dead in its tracks and begins slowly backing up. And then suddenly turns around and darts in the other direction. Well, the tribesman feels rather confident of himself and thinks, yeah, you know who's your daddy. I got this. And just then he hears behind him another growl, a little deeper this time. He turns around and looks, and there is this enormous lion standing right behind him. The panther was never scared of the tribesman at all. The panther saw the lion that was coming out of the forest behind the tribesman, and he ran for his life. Now, that story might not have ended so well for the tribesman, but when we consider that same picture for yourself, that is how God treats you in your temptation. There are times that he allows the panther to come. He allows the fear to set in. He allows the temptation to grip you just a bit. And he's looking to see, will you resist? Will you stand ever so smallly for me? Will you stand for righteousness? And when he sees that happen, then he will come out of the forest behind you, and the tempter will flee. He will run for his life, not because he is intimidated by you, but because he is intimidated by one greater than you. He is intimidated by the Lion of the tribe of Judah who stands with you. But God often looks to see, will we resist ever so smallly before he comes out and delivers us? Why? Because God will never leave us stranded. We're never alone. God will never leave us stranded in our temptation. But God understands that we're weak. We need help. We need others that will strengthen us in our moments of weaknesses, trials, and temptations. And that's why the third thing that God does is he surrounds us. How does he surround us? He surrounds us with his people. My favorite picture in the entire Bible of God's people is found in Ephesians Chapter 6. My favorite picture is not that of the church being the bride of Christ, which that's a beautiful picture, or the church being the body of Christ, which is an incredibly practical picture. My favorite picture is that which is found in Ephesians chapter 6. It's the picture of the phalanx. It's what Paul is describing whenever he says, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might, put on the full armor of God. Now we with American eyes and ears tend to think about something like Captain America, this lone soldier out there fighting off all the forces of evil. And so when we hear Paul describe the belt of truth and the feet fitted with the readiness of the gospel of peace and the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit and the shield of faith and breastplate of righteousness and this stuff, when we hear all that, that's what we think of. We think of being suited up and able to go face the forces of evil by ourselves. That is not what Paul had in mind at all. What Paul had in mind was the Roman soldier. He was picturing the Roman soldier that we know that Paul was literally chained to there in prison as he wrote the book of Ephesians. And when he looked over and he saw this soldier, he considered, how do soldiers fight? How do Roman soldiers fight? Well, they fought what was called a phalanx. If you've ever seen the movie 300, or you've learned in your history classes about Leonidas and his famous 300 Spartans who stood up against the hundreds of thousands of immortals who came from Assyria, and they fought them off. These 300 men fought off these Assyrian immortals. They did that by use of the phalanx. The phalanx was the greatest advancement in military technology of the time. It was, in a sense, similar to a tank today. And what it was these soldiers would take their shields, and they would link them together side to side to side to side. And then the man that stood behind the soldier in the front would take his shield and put it over top of him so that the only thing that was visible was basically a little bit for their eyes there at the top and maybe a place on the side where they might put a sword or a spear through. It was a fortress. It was impregnable. And this was the technology that the Romans used to conquer all of Europe in their day. It was an incredibly effective military tool because it protected the entire army, and it provided a way for them to be defended while also being able to fight back. This is Paul's picture of the church. You are standing shoulder to shoulder, side to side, with people behind you and in front of you, with shields all around you, not just your shield, but everyone else's shield, standing with you to protect you from the onslaught of demonic attack in the forms of trials and temptations. And there are times when you are weak and you might fall, and your shield might fall down and collapse. But God's vision for the church is that those to the left and those to the right are quick and able to bring their shields in your place and collapse in on top of you and protect you and bring you back inside where you can be nurtured and cared for and helped and built back up so that you can again join back in the shield front. Me and my friend Jack here at the church have taken it upon ourselves to routinely call one another shield bearers. We'll say it's good to bear shields with you, friend. And this is the idea that we have. You, likewise, should be praying that God would give you a shield bearer. Hey, married people listening, I want you to understand that the number one shield bearer that God has for you is your spouse. Husbands, it's your wife. Wives, it's your husband. That's what it's been for me. My wife, Danielle, has helped me, sustained me, propped me up, defended me spiritually in more ways than she even realizes. The most profound way was very early in our relationship. When I was around 21 or 22 years old, I went through an incredible crisis of faith. It was the worst experience of that kind in my life. I had had a close family member die who I was not sure of their salvation, and it just put me in a tailspin. I began questioning everything. The reality of God, the goodness of God, the reality of hell, the exclusivity of Christianity. None of it was making sense, and I was getting so consternated by the whole thing. Just in angst all the time. I can remember waking up, going to church, and just looking in the mirror, wanting to pull my hair out, wanting to rip my skin off because I was just so tore up over worshiping this God that I wasn't even sure I wanted to worship anymore. And in the middle of that, so Danielle and I were dating, we got engaged, we got married in the middle of all this time. And I would ask her, I said, does this not scare you? And she'd go, no, I think you're going to get through it. She just stood with me. She never doubted me. She just stood by me. Meanwhile, God had given to me enough wherewithal, enough circumspection to consider the fact that, Andrew, if you make shipwreck of faith here, if you throw caution to the wind and toss all of this away, make no mistake, you are taking someone with you. You're taking this girl with you. That, her presence, that knowledge of her being with me was enough to slow me down and make me think, okay, I'm just going to hunker down and wait for the storm to pass and not go crazy just off the deep end with this struggle that I'm having right now. And sure enough, as time went by, it took 2 years. The storm passed. Actually, it was Danielle. On a whim, she bought a book for me, The Reason for God by Timothy Keller. I highly recommend it. I read that book like a drowning man going to oxygen, and I began to make my way back to the Lord. And in that situation, it was not because of my faith. It was because of her faith. Sometimes that's the case for you. Single people, you might not have it in a spouse, but God means for you to have it in somebody. If you don't know who that person is right now, I urge you to pray that. Pray specifically that. God, give me a shield bearer. But the last thing that God does for us, because He will not leave you stranded in your temptation, as awesome as these first three are, blocking your path and making the tempter run for his life and surrounding you with God's people, and as effective as those things are, they are not the most awesome. You know what the most awesome way of escape is? The most awesome fulfillment of the promise that God will not leave you stranded in your temptation. You know what the most awesome one is? It is Jesus Himself. How so? It is in Jesus that we learn about how God looked at you and joined you in your temptation. Hebrews chapter 4, verses 15 through 16 is descriptive of this. It says that we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with us in our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all ways, as we are, yet without sin. And then it says, let us therefore come to the throne of grace with confidence, where we can find mercy and grace to help in our time of need. Do you understand what is being said there? Here it is, simplified. God looked at sinful humanity, and He looked at you in sinful humanity. He looked at you specifically. And He said, you are too weak. You are too alone in your struggle with sin. I know what I'll do. I will join you. I will come down and experience it with you. I will become susceptible to sin myself, to suffering myself, to trials myself. I will make myself weak like you are weak. But where you fall, I will stand. Where you are weak, Jesus is strong. I love movies as examples of just things in the spiritual life. And one of my favorite pictures is related to this specifically is the picture of Bruce Willis in the movie Unbreakable. And Bruce Willis is discovering, as the movie progresses, that he has superhuman strength. He's just a normal guy, but there's something special about him. And it's his son who discovers it first. And so he's downstairs, Bruce Willis is, and he's lifting weights. He's doing the bench press. And as he's bench pressing, his son comes down and watches him. And he's like, how much can you bench press, Dad? And Bruce was like, I don't know. I've never really tried. It's been years since I've maxed out. And he says, can we see? He says, yeah. And he begins putting weights on the side of the bench press. And he puts it up and puts it down, and he just keeps adding weights. And it's easy for him every time he does it. And he's not even sure how much is getting put on. He just keeps, they put all the weights that they can on the bench press. And then they're like, let's see what else we can put on. And they start putting paint cans and cinder blocks and whatever they can find in the basement. See if Bruce Willis can push it up. And he always is able to easily put it up and put it down. See, that's the picture of Jesus. No matter how intense the temptation, he was always able to endure it. You know what that means? That means that Jesus has experienced temptation of a kind that you never have. You give in way too early. I give in way too early. Jesus never gave in. He always kept pushing up the bench press, and never was it discovered where he would finally buckle under the pressure. Satan was exhausted in his tempting efforts, and Jesus never gave an iota. He never had a lustful thought. He never allowed anger to grip his heart. He never allowed greed to grip his life. He never sinned. And so what that means, the author of Hebrews tells you, is that rather than God looking at you and going, you waste of space. Well, why don't you get it in gear? Those words have never come across the lips of Jesus. Jesus has never looked at you and said, why can't you figure this out? He has never looked at you and said, again, what's your problem? He has never looked at you and complained of your weaknesses. No, rather, he has sympathized with your weaknesses. He looks at your failures, your weaknesses. He says, I remember what that was like, but I never failed. And so because I never failed, I have a strength that you don't have. And I'm offering that to you. I'm offering you the strength which is mine, which is the greatest fulfillment of how God joins us in our temptations. He joins us in our temptations ultimately at the cross, where Christ died. 2 Corinthians 5:21 would put it this way. He made him, God the Father, made Christ the Son. He made him who knew no sin to be sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. Do you know what that means? That means that Jesus literally lived a sinless life, never gave an inch towards temptation, and then when it was finished, at his crucifixion, when he had lived a perfect life, he allowed himself to trade places with you so that your sin, your failures would be attached to him and his perfection would be attached to you. That's what the gospel teaches. I know it sounds too good to be true, but it's not too good to be true. It is the good news of Jesus Christ. That's why it's good news. He gets your sin and you get his righteousness. It is a transference of your sin to him, his holiness and perfection to you. That means, and I want you to stop and think about this for a moment. I want you to think about the sin in your life. The one or two or however many you hope and pray no one ever finds out about. That sin, whatever that is, I want you to consider the fact that that is what Jesus became on the cross. Jesus became the adulterer. Jesus became the addict. Jesus became the thief. Jesus became the greedy person. Jesus became the idolater. Jesus became the transgender. Jesus became the homosexual. Jesus became the angry person. Jesus became the murderer. Jesus became, you name it. On the cross, he became that so that you might get his righteousness, so that when God looked at you, he would not see your sin. He would see the righteousness of Jesus. Could there be a better way of escape? Could there be a more potent affirmation that God will not leave you stranded in your temptation, trials, and sin? No, he'll come after you. He pursues you all the way to the cross of Christ. He dies for you. He gives his life for you. He trades his place with you. Will you take this raft? Will you believe this message? Will you cling to the cross? Will you cling to Christ and find in him your salvation, your way of escape? the God who promises that he will never leave you stranded in your temptation. God bless. I hope and pray that this message leaves you encouraged and helped. Amen.